Oh, it was good to talk to Grace.
Yeah, she's delightful, and she's somebody I met on Clubhouse, actually. But then we realized that we lived like 8 blocks away from her, so then it was like, how about you come in and chat with us? She's a landlady. She owns buildings and has tenants, and so there's a lot of parallels between our life and hers.
And the clubhouse that you met her on was an intentional communities room, right?
Yes, right. Yeah, so she's very interested in that right now because she's kind of seeing that take form in the way she's kind of managing her property and the tenants in it. And so it was super fun to draw those parallels and to explore those conversations with her. And so hope you enjoy it. Yeah, thanks for coming.
Hello, Grace. Welcome.
Hello. Hey,
Thanks
Teel.
for being here.
Yeah. Hey, Debbie.
Grace and I have been Clubhouse friends, and we met, but then we realized we were both in Chicago, and you live like just a couple miles away from us.
Yeah, not about 2 miles.
Yeah.
Just down the street, kind of.
Wow.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
That's incredible. So she came over and visited a few weeks ago and saw the side yard and met Tom and I, and we hung out. But it's cool to. I think this is the first time I'm really seeing your face because we had masks on, and we're all past the vaccine now. It's exciting. Yeah. But thanks we've been talking in Clubhouse rooms about community, and that's been really, really fun to have those conversations. And we've been kind of diving deep into like why community, and then. But I want to, for everybody else that doesn't know what you're doing, I want to kind of start by asking you to kind of explain who you are and the work that you do and how community is becoming more and more a piece of that, if you don't mind kicking us off with that.
Yeah, I was sort of thinking about this on my drive, like where do I start? And like if we go all the way to the beginning of this, or at least me diving into development, I sort of started by working on projects looking at senior housing. And, trying to, it was sort of seeing how particularly in the US, we kind of put people into senior care facilities and cut them off from society. And in taking care of the elderly, sort of trying to figure out how to reconnect them back into society. And it is within community, and it's like preventative health, all of these things. And I'm like, all of a sudden we're looking at a totally different kind of a cost at the end of the road. And how do we put this into the beginning of the equation? And so it's through building intentional, it's intentional design. And so starting from there, fast forward to where we are now, all of a sudden we're talking about this in a deeper way again. And I'm looking at how we design to live intentionally. How do we design to allow people to have those connections? And then, the term being age in place for seniors.
Right.
But, that in terms of the work is where I'm at. My personal interest, I guess, I've moved around a lot since I was a child and never really felt like I fit in anywhere, and yet always had to, create community or plug into something. And it's been, as I've gotten older, realizing that community is outside of my door. And I just have to embrace that. And I have to almost welcome, encourage other people to join me in that, right? To reconnect people from whatever their bubble of me and then everyone else. And it's like, you're not that isolated, just look up from your phone. Let's just smile at one another. And all of a sudden that starts to bridge the beginning of reconnecting with community from, your few neighbors to your block to your few blocks and the greater community. So that's really where that starts for me. And, now particularly, I think with this last year and over the last couple of years, the idea of intentional community really coming back hard and people realizing we've gotten so far away from living in community and that seeking of it. So that's sort of where I've been with all of it.
Great.
It's been really interesting. It's been really nice to hear how much more open people are to living in community, and what does that really mean? I think is different for each individual, and I think that's sort of going to be an interesting topic for us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've talked about like people say they want, like people are lonely in wanting to connect, but they might not necessarily, do they really want community, because it does cost something, like it costs some kind of
Yeah. What
buy-in.
does that mean to them, and what are they willing to show up at? Are they willing to show up? Are they willing to participate?
Yeah.
And
'Cause
you
it's
will
not
hit some point where they may not.
Right. It's
You
not a
know.
consumption thing. Like you can't just consume it. You have to, if you're going to show, you have to show up and give into it. Like,
Yeah. You
Well,
know,
and you have to bring your whole self, and that's hard. I mean, it's vulnerable, and people aren't always wanting that kind of.
and there's real
vulnerability.
work.
Yeah.
There's real work, and when we are isolated, when we can keep our doors closed, you can kind of talk yourself out of doing the work.
Yeah.
You don't have to participate.
yeah.
As it turns out, when you're by yourself, you don't have to participate with yourself.
Right.
But when you're with others, there is that piece where it's like, hey, you know, this keeps happening.
Yeah.
And if we're going to keep doing this, you have to address it in some way.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
We have some good friends in the neighborhood who had lived on their own, and then as they aged, they now have an apartment in the Admiral, and they talk about this kind of not really forced. I mean, it kind of is forced community, right? Like with this, it's a senior residence, and they talk to us about like, oh, living in community is challenging. But they didn't really choose the other folks that they're creating this community with, right? Like in a senior housing. And I always talk when we have people who come to visit, we talk about how it's like really socially acceptable to like share housing when you're in college or when you're young or single. And then at the end of your life, again, it's socially acceptable to be in these senior residences and have community again. But like in the in-between time, it's sort of seen as like, I don't know, some kind of step backwards or some kind of like, oh, you're not making it. I don't know.
Yeah. Can you tell that story of when you were doing that project? Vaguely.
No.
No.
I mean,
It was just like a comment, right?
it was just a
that
comment.
insinuated like, well, people do, this can't be your whole life. This is just for young people or something.
Yes, they said at some point you have to grow up and pay your taxes. And I was like, oh, okay, well.
What am I
which
doing?
is a separate conversation, but it's. I feel like this is where that idea of, you know, what is the American dream, and then this idea of what a nuclear family is versus community, and that individuality. And it's like, but that's not actually that. Let's take that out of the equation. Let's talk about what it actually can be to be an individual, and then part of a society and part of a community.
Right.
Yeah, and I feel like that some of those ideas and some of those comments is part of what has led us to this place that we sit in as a greater society.
Right.
Yeah. Questioning all that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I can have my opinion, you can have your opinion, but we can still, like, we can share a meal, we can live in community.
Yeah.
That's sort of the strength of the fabric of community.
Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
What does this look like right now for you? Like specifically, I know you own some buildings.
Yeah.
And tell me more about that. Like we talked about it a little bit.
I have. Well, now I just have 2 locations. I have 4 buildings at 2 sites in Lakeview, and it turns out that everybody has gathered there and live in their own little communities. There's a sort of a more like an artist community off of Irving Park, and that has been really wonderful. And they really in the last year. They've become sort of a compound of their own, and they really, the way that they sort of, I guess, sometimes share resources and whatnot, and they very much live intentionally, and I think that they have always been that in a community and just in different spaces. And I'm kind of looking to see if I can build that or redevelop that into a larger a larger space for more people to be able to
Nice.
participate.
Yeah.
So that's what's happening there. Where I'm currently living, I have a couple of units with a variety of different people, and there's I guess the back house is really where a lot more people flow through, and that's the space where I'll pop in and we'll cook dinner together.
Nice.
And even within the whole building during COVID, we were able to sit everybody on their back porches and
Nice.
share a meal together.
Yeah.
And whatnot. So that definitely exists. And then anything that I participate in, I invite all of my tenants and my friends to come join me.
Yeah.
And that's so that's an intentional community. It's been really interesting to move from particularly being a landlord with tenants, but then cross that and be able to wear that hat, but be able to take that hat off and just be friends and to engage in a different way as well. And it's not a transaction.
Yeah, that can
Is
be
that
complicated.
tricky sometimes?
Yeah.
though?
Yeah, that definitely is. I think for all of us, but at the same time, like they're willing to navigate that with me, and that's part of the intention is we're all navigating this together. And it's what they've said to me is it's really refreshing.
Yeah.
And it makes them really want to stay, and particularly in the last year, like it's been difficult for everyone, but we've all had known that we've had each other around, and they've always known that I'm there and willing to listen and willing to have a conversation, about whatever is going on.
And that's so great too, because it breaks down some of those definitions and some of those like divisions, between like the owner and the tenant, and those are divisions that are false, right? I mean, they don't have to be there. And I think that's, it can be challenging, but totally worth it. And like you're saying, even if there's something that you're in a position of power or whatever over your tenants.
It's responsibility. I call it because it's really not about the power piece.
Right.
But the responsibility ultimately falls on me.
Right.
So it's actually, so when I talk about it that way, it changes the dynamic as well, and sort of also the way people come at me with requests and issues and whatnot.
And maybe will change the way if they end up moving somewhere else, might even change the way they respond to their next landlord or whatever. So you're kind of creating this shift in their thinking too, which is great.
Yeah, and how they engage, and how they use a space and how they move around a space, because those are all parts of that.
It kind of it humanizes you as a landlady.
Very much.
Right. So and that's why I would argue that's why we have those divisions, because it's to humanize. When we humanize like the landlord or the boss or the whatever it is, then that makes it complicated, because then it's harder to be mad at them when they're a human, or to discredit them, or to like transfer your shame onto them, or
frustrations and all of these things,
when
these things that aren't in your control and not in anyone's control, or it's like if you want all of these fixes or you want these things, your rents might have to go up. Are we prepared to, I'm willing to do this, but at the end of the day, this is how it goes, and where do we really want to be together? I'm willing to have this conversation. Right now we're having this conversation about fire pits.
Oh, nice.
So
it just basically makes everything a little more complicated. You have to have more nuanced conversations. You have to be more thoughtful in the way you approach things. And that's, I would argue, the reason why why we have the system we have now, of everything kind of having a place and being compartmentalized, and not having this kind of these kind of funny relationships where you switch hats and I'm also your neighbor and your friend. Because it's messy, and it's it takes more work, but I guess my question then is what is it worth it? What fruit do you see from it?
So some days it feels like it's not, but it ultimately, at the end of the day, it absolutely is. And part of it is I'm willing to get messy. I'm willing to be in the mess, and I'm comfortable in that.
Where did you get that? Where do you think that comes from?
Life is messy. life is messy. And like, I guess if, you know, for me, I guess at some point I decided that if I'm not uncomfortable every day, I'm not growing. And I'm not out there, you know, doing what you're supposed to be doing with your life, which is experiencing it.
Yeah.
So that's, I think, where that comes from,
Yeah.
which exhausts a lot of people.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah, I resonate strongly with everything you're sharing because I am a coordinator. We call it a coordinator at Jesus People, and so I have to take the responsibility sometimes of being like the shift manager of a certain area, or the chores, the guy who's putting the chores list together, or hey, we actually need you to do this job instead of that job, or like, hey, you haven't been showing up. What's the deal? Like, so I have to put that hat on, and it's hard to take that hat off, or to have other people not see me with, as even if I feel like I've taken it off, that doesn't mean other people
Right.
don't see the hat on me. Like, so the switching back, and then I feel I've had to deal with like the anxiety of like going into this is before the pandemic, but going into the dining room, and it's like, or a big gathering of all of us, and I have to feel like, oh, sometimes on a bad day, I feel like all I see are like all the problems that I've had, like that I'm perceiving that everybody else is perceiving that I'm the bad guy, or like I'm the guy that had to call them out for this or that. And I just like that switching back and forth can be like anxiety producing, or like there's a growing edge to that. And I think I'm still, but I think what I hear you saying is like, you built some kind of trust, like that your tenants feel like you're there with them. And I think on a good day, that's how I feel. Like if I've like built like that, if people trust that I have their best interests in mind and I'm really there for them, I'm ready, I'm like here for it. Then I don't feel that as much, but it just takes more work to build that kind of a relationship. So I appreciate you. That's real.
Yeah, you kind of have to lead with that. Like you have to be very vulnerable and like put yourself out there first and foremost and always. For someone to meet you in that space. You know, I think particularly like because I'm not in an intentional community, I'm kind of really creating it and creating the space for it. So I don't get to not participate.
Yeah. I mean, you're saying I love this idea of responsibility versus power, because I mean, someone does have to take care of the property and has to make decisions, and I mean, so someone has to do those things, and taking on the responsibility comes with a cost that you guys were both sharing, that sometimes you have to make unpopular decisions, or you have to be the one that says like, oh, you can't have that fire on your porch, or whatever it is. And so I just think there's a lot of, I mean, there can be some difficulty with it, but there's a lot of gifts to it too, because then you do see people grow, or you are able to sort of, I don't know, have those hard conversations because you've built trust. But I think a lot of people shy away from taking responsibility too. And I mean,
I've certainly seen that happen even within what I'm doing. You know, at some point you see where someone may have the intention or say the words, and then where they really fall on the line of walking it. And realizing that you can't push, you can only set the space for it, and then do whatever needs to be done. And then, you know, it's a very interesting. Like it's almost, I want to say it's almost like parenting. It must almost be like parenting, or what I see that being is, okay, like that's where we're at.
And the gap between, when there's a gap between what somebody wants to do, like the responsibility they want to take, or the job they want to take, the gap between that and what they actually have the capability for whatever reasons of doing, and the tools and the knowledge and the maturity and the perspective and stability to actually follow through on it and like take the heat essentially of what that comes with it. If the wider that gap is, the kind of harder it is to
that
what-
has caused tensions and problems because like for me, you know, changing people's rents and whatnot based on what they're willing to contribute or what they're saying they're going to do, but when that doesn't actually happen and having to have that conversation, that's not fun.
No.
And that has led to issues. So it's like having the clarity and which, you know, how do you then resolve all these conflicts? And like these are things that I've had to kind of fly by the seat of my pants to kind of figure out. So it's been really great having the conversations around like, well, how do you resolve conflict and what kind of conflicts need to be resolved openly and then which ones like really need to be one-on-one. Like, so then it's like, okay, I'm building properties, I'm managing them, I'm kind of trying to hold community and then there's this other piece within it, and it's like, oh, all of this, like how are we going to manage all of it, and when is it too personal?
Right. Oh, that's interesting. This came up just a couple of weeks ago. It wasn't a big conflict, but I had sort of a conflict with another coworker, and maybe because I've been around students and like when we have conflicts with students, we're supposed to bring in another person so that there's not like that power dynamic, right? Yeah. So it can be another student or another teacher, but so you're just not one-on-one.
Yeah.
And the coworker that I had a conflict with was younger than me, and I just thought, oh, it'd be nice to pull someone else in. I don't want it to feel like I'm the boss, you know, coming down heavy or like, and so I pulled Teel in, and the other person just felt really hurt that I couldn't talk to just them. And we were able to talk out like my intention and sort of where I was coming from. But the beginning of the conversation started off really rough because like in my coworker's mind, it was just like, oh, you couldn't just talk to me yourself? And I was like, oh no,
it's like the opposite of what you're.
Yeah, I was really trying to be caring, and I also know my own self that I can get off topic or I can sort of nitpick, and I know Teel really has my back and won't be like, that's not. Let's come back to let's get back on track here. So I explained all that, and then actually he and I were able to resolve without Teel because anyway. But it was interesting, right? Because I thought, oh, there's a little bit of this dynamic of like boss or whatever, I don't know, manager. And then also the age difference. And I just thought, oh, it'd be nice if there was someone like just a neutral third party that we're both good friends with Teel. So I just thought, oh, this is a good neutral person.
Yeah.
But then it sort of backfired.
Yeah. One of those things.
So to make it more complicated, any common language or practice that you come up with is like, this is how we're going to do conflict. It won't work for every situation. So you have to have like a million like, you know what I mean? Like, well, with this person, we got to remember. And it's very much like, there's so much care that goes into it. And and again, I see why people don't do that. I see why there's a one size fits all and like a big corporation for HR. This is how we do this. This is the procedure, and fall in line. If it doesn't work for you, like, kind of too bad. And it's like, but when you do kind of put people first and relationships first, and like you make that the priority and the caring for everyone, it's a lot more work.
And there was a different situation that had happened earlier, and I wanted to talk to this other coworker. And I asked them, oh, can you and I just resolve this, or would you like to have, someone with you? And they really did want to have a friend come with them to talk it out. And I thought, maybe that's just a good way forward. Just ask. Like,
don't assume.
I don't know. Don't assume.
Yeah, you really can't assume, because it turns out that we can look at the same thing and have a completely different response and reaction or perspective on that. And so, it's always.
But I think we're just not used to conflict in general. Like, just saying that, like, hey, like, it's just, I don't know if it'll ever not be awkward, a little bit awkward at least, to be like, hey, we have a conflict. Do you want to have another person here? I don't know. It just feels kind of clunky coming out. Like, there's almost no way to, or maybe it's just like, it
is clunky.
It's only awkward
but it's
if you
going
make
to
it
be
awkward.
Clunky. And it's okay. And I think part of part of the thing that I'm seeing and what's positive to me is seeing that there's so many people who are doing self-work, right? Everybody is like starting to be more okay with being in therapy, and these are the words. So now there's this common language beneath the surface that we're all doing personally, and that will come out in every other engagement we have. And so I think that that's why it's so important to take care of oneself first.
Absolutely.
Because it is by taking care of yourself that you can engage with others, and it has that rippling effect.
I 100% agree, and then it's just the question of like, you can't force that process, right? Of people taking care of themselves.
No, not at all. Not at all.
And sometimes in the middle of the process, things get messier before they get better, right? Like if someone is just starting the work.
That's something that I'm currently, that I've over the last couple of weeks, but over the last few months have been having to really experience and walk through with someone. And this is like a fresh thing for me. So it's like, oh, how do I even talk about this? Like this is kind of, but at what point, and this is where it's the, if we're going to sit in community and in this intention, but what if someone just needs that much more support and that much more help? It's like that they're affecting the community.
Right.
What does that mean?
Yeah.
And how do you do that? So have you guys had these types of situations, and what happens within that? Because it's kind of heartbreaking. It's really, really difficult, but for the greater good, like how do you do that?
I mean, I think
I was hoping you would know to help us.
I think we sort of take turns being the neediest member of the community, like like when my husband's father passed away, and they were living in Austria, and so he was gone for a month, and he has an important job of keeping our building running. He's the building manager, and so people just kind of rising to the challenge of taking over his responsibilities while he was gone, and then when he came back, and to be grieving, that's a big space to take up, and just sort of watching over the years people sort of giving that space to each other when we need it. And we've had folks that have gone through divorces and different losses, and then also just different mental health crises or different things, and it can be really challenging, and sometimes I think it can feel overwhelming even for the person who is the needy sounds so negative, but the one in need, or the one that sort of is going through whatever. I think it can feel a little overwhelming for that person as well, because everyone is really, we're pretty good at those things and coming alongside folks, but I think it's also sort of, I don't know, can be a little overwhelming as well. So just kind of knowing like when too much is, when what how you're trying to come alongside, if that's too much or not enough. So I think we're able to communicate fairly well what we need from each other.
And we all have different, like I'm realizing some of this might be jargon that only Japuza people say or Christians say, but that like we all have different burdens for different people. Yeah. So like, it's like, I might be like, just like I have a few people that I'm like, I'm always going to go to bat for them. And like, hey, don't forget about this person, because they went through this and this and this when they were kids, or this is what they came from right when they moved in, or remember they're going through this right now. And so like, keep that in mind when you're complaining about them, or we're trying to solve this problem around them. Like, just like, we got to be careful.
Holding.
Yeah. But Debbie might like just really not feel that burden for them specifically. Like she might have a general compassion for them. She's like, yes, I totally get it, but I need
problem at work is.
But it's really a problem, and then vice versa. Like there's people that I just feel like I lose my patience. Like for whatever reason, I don't have as much patience as Debbie has or somebody else has, and there's a lot of taking turns. And like one of the things I say most often to my colleague who does this work with me. It's like, I don't think I have the words for this meeting. Do you have the words? Like, who has the words? Like, for the meeting that we're about to have, because I'm not feeling it that I have it. I'm mostly feeling like this or that, and so if you can lead, then I will back you up. And so it's like, again, that's self-work though, right? Because that's recognizing like, this is not a gap for somebody else. This is my own gap, like my own lack, that I'm lacking compassion right now or whatever. And so we lean on each other and share that.
Yeah.
I think that helps make space for everyone.
And that's sort of part of the fabric. Like you guys have a richer fabric because you have so many more people who can participate.
The sheer numbers
like
game,
when, and you will have more people to be able to like take the place and to share the burden, as you put it, right?
Yeah.
Versus when you're talking about a couple of people or a small community, which we've sort of had some of these conversations where people have realized that when it's a community of like 3 or 4 families or people coming together, that when one person doesn't participate, like they stop being able to be that. They can no longer function.
Yeah, it's like that's 20% of your community is out down for the count.
Yeah.
And it's like, you feel it more.
Yeah.
Yeah, I am thankful for as messy as it is to have 180 people to try to figure out how to live together. There's definitely a lot of benefits to the kind of critical mass of being able to like shoulder the load.
But I think it's interesting, earlier you were talking about like the responsibility holding and the conversations, and I was just thinking that, sometimes people want you to be that mean landlady or the one in charge or whatever, so they have someone to complain about or there's like an idea in their mind. Have you encountered that and had to kind of break through that?
A little bit. And you know what, I don't have to break through that. I just allow that to happen. I don't take it personally. We all kind of need like we need the other. We all need the other, and I have thick enough skin that I can handle that. It also gives me the space to like be left alone a little bit.
Right.
So,
I resonate with that, because there's been, folks over the years that maybe haven't been a great fit or needed to be mad at our community or whatever, and I'm like, we're big enough.
We can be that.
We can be that. If you need that, we can be that. It's okay.
Yeah, I definitely feel there's like like good cop, bad cop sometimes that just naturally happens. And it's like, if 2 of us meet with somebody and have to communicate a hard thing and they demonize one of us and one of us was like the good guy and one of us was the bad guy. And then they get to, but at least they come out of it with a good guy.
Right.
Like they have somebody, at least one of us they can lean on and still trust to talk to.
Yeah.
And so it's like, I don't mind I can be the bad guy for a season or for maybe forever for them, but like, but hopefully not. But like, as long as we aren't cut off completely, so we can keep this going, keep a relationship going, it's painful though. It's not fun.
No, it's not fun.
To feel
it's not fun. It's always good. That's part of the thing. Like, it's been really interesting doing a lot of this on my own. And not having that other to bounce things off of.
Can't imagine, by the way.
Whatnot. There have been some moments, but it's given me a much stronger sense of self. And I've had to kind of take time to kind of decide which pieces are like complete sort of like non-negotiables, and they're not that many. Right? They're not that many. It's like a couple of things that just need to happen in order to keep things rolling. Then everything else can be a conversation. And it's very uncomfortable. Like I can't,
If you don't mind me asking, what are those non-negotiables and how do you communicate those to people? Like, is it just straight up
they're rent issues, right? So it's just like, you need to be participating, at least you need to be paying, and then, you need to be able to communicate. And so it really falls down to those pieces, and then everything else can be communicated around. And then I'm kind of trying to work around when somebody is impacting those around them, what are sort of the non-negotiables or like the things that they you have to at least have awareness of in order to participate. And I imagine you guys have that too, in terms of, if you're going to be here, you have to at least show up in these very basic ways.
Yeah.
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 And it's that becomes even outside of intentional community, there's like roommate issues.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh,
It's like
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's ground
common
rules,
human
right? Yeah.
things.
I think it's great that you said that you have a stronger sense of self, because I think a lot of people think that living in an intentional community or participating in community, you sort of like lose yourself or sacrifice your independence or some, I don't know, strange. I think it has to do with this American dream, false.
It's like a false dichotomy of like either
Yeah.
you get the dream and you get to be yourself,
Right.
or you sacrifice all of your individuality and you kind of cave
Well,
into
it's
the.
what is your right? What are those individual things? What are the things that define you? Right? So, I mean, this goes into a conversation about identity, which is like belonging, which is maybe where like intentional community really comes from. Like, do we want to belong?
Yeah.
What is your identity tied to? Is it tied to who you live with? Is it tied to how you live? Is it tied to what is that?
Yeah.
We're all exploring that.
Totally.
So.
And I think that, I mean, the American dream is so strange that, like, the quote unquote of this, individual family living in this house with the picket fence and, the yard and the space. Like, even in thinking about it, it like creates this kind of these boundaries, this space between that family and anyone else. And it's just, that's not really how anybody lives, right? I mean, there's so much richness in a neighborhood, where your kids go to school. Like any of the peripheral things really create community. I mean, people participate in all sorts of different communities, but somehow we're not making those. I think we're starting to. I think there's a lot more conversations about like what it means to belong and what you have to bring to the whatever community you're in to really have a sense of belonging and not just fitting in, as Brené Brown would say, like this authenticity and the vulnerability that it takes. And I think people are starting to realize that that's worth it. The messiness is totally the price for admission, right, to a full life.
Yeah, I somehow thinking about that. I'm trying to find the words for it, but like we've gone from like what this individuality means, or the definition of that, to the reaction to that, to the counter reaction to that, and like somewhere and now we're in the middle of, okay, we're coming out of this very large societal fabric. We're seeking community. We've tried to go very like polar, like I just want to be around people who are exactly like me. I'm like, I still don't quite like, that's too much. Like I still have conflict in this space and it's suffocating me. So now we're having to reconnect to a greater community and have that tolerance and communicate through that. So yeah, that's sort of how I'm seeing it. And somehow you talking about, particularly with that American dream and with the picket fence especially, all I'm seeing is someone like blowing this leaf off of their yard onto their neighbor's yard, but it's like off of their yard.
Right.
And somehow that to me is sort of the image of like, well, that's sort of where the problem started, and that divisiveness, and coming back around from that to, okay, how do we break this all down? Because the community doesn't stop at the picket fence.
Right.
Yeah. There has to be some kind of sense of kind of global ownership that we care about, that I care about your yard. Or else we're not going to be. And the piece that I was thinking about is like when you're talking about identity, like where we find our identity, and it feels, I wasn't here obviously when Jesus People started, but I would venture to guess that it was more of the identity of the members of Jesus People then was found in like, we are Jesus people, like, as in like we are like, we're doing a different thing than everybody else, like almost like identity in the radical nature of we're living this way and we believe this and this is how we're, and and I feel like that's still a part of it, but that like I feel like we're more bound by like, wow, community is hard.
Yeah.
And the messiness is hard, and we're all in it together.
Yeah.
And so like that, the living together was like a way that could make all the work that we would do possible, but it became more of like the living together and the messiness of it became more of the thing. Like that's all what we're doing and together. And I think that's become more of the identity, is like the camaraderie of just the messiness and the gifts and the challenges of community and doing this thing together. And that is more, that's easier to share, because anybody that's living in communally in any type of way, or just in their family, it's a universal struggle. So like I can talk to you, the fact that we can talk to you who are not living in like a traditional, like in a commune, but you're living in an apartment that you own and operate, and you're still, it's common struggles and gifts that we can talk about together. And I think maybe that's just something good about that. I don't know if it's a good thing, but yeah, I guess I hope that the things that form our identity are things that we can share together, rather than like things that like make like an in-group. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think those are the pieces that resonate and create that's what draws people to community, right? That's sort of the secret sauce. Yeah. And it's not specific to Jesus People and to whatnot, like you guys carry that, but it's really something that each community does have, whether they can kind of put their finger on it or not. Yeah. And that's ultimately what draws people to community, or allows them to connect in community.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, like earlier you said, you were talking about how like you just like, it's messy, or I asked you like what allows you to be able to like do this hard thing, and you said like I don't mind getting in the messiness of it. And I guess I'm just like, I'm wanting to like somehow like dig deeper into that, of like, where does that come from, that quality come from, of a willingness to, a comfortability to step into that?
I mean, I think that's the resilience of like how I grew up. And at the age of, I grew up in California in like a little suburbia town, but I was one of like 3 Asian families in an otherwise white town. And, kind of struggling with identity in that space, but knowing I'm very much American. And then at the age of 10, moving out to Taiwan. And that is a complete shift, right? And like not having a say, and literally having, I think, maybe 1 month of like, hey, this is happening, we're gonna pick you up and we're throwing you on a plane. And then, I went from there while my parents were like packing us up and making this transition. I got bumped around my relatives. And I had an aunt who lived in a monastery. She was a monk. It's weird to call her a Buddhist nun. She's a monk. Yeah, it's a monk, yeah. And but they're a closed monastery. And my sister and I went to go live there, and this was for a couple of weeks. And that was the only time they've had kids running through their halls. Wow. But like that was a wonderful experience. Was that in California? That was in Taiwan. So that was like up in the mountains of Taiwan. Like, wow. They got to practice their English. And we just really, it was a very interesting engagement, and something that I think all of them remembered. I mean, I think that's a very special thing, and it's a very special thing when I go visit as much as I can. Yeah. And I think for them, it's like it's almost like it was yesterday kind of moment. Nice. But in any case, all of these things that made me realize that things around you change, right? The only things that really don't change is like you
Yeah.
and how you respond to things, and then the stars in the sky. Like
Yeah,
you will always
nice.
be able to look up, and that won't change.
Yeah.
And that kind of resilience, I think, has just made everything else that much more like it's gonna come and go. It's gonna be whatever it is, but how you meet someone and how you engage with someone, that matters, and that you're going to remember, and that is what you need to like move forward with, right? Because like we moved into a tiny apartment. My grandparents then moved in.
Oh,
I mean,
wow.
it just like all of these different changes. So it was like dealing across different languages and different cultures, and different identities, and like kind of being almost identityless for a very long time. And it was like, and then coming back to the U.S. and realizing, oh, I've actually experienced this full circle and cycle of existence. And a lot of the people around me, this is their first time leaving home when I went to college, or like this is as far as they've gotten, which is an hour from where they were born. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it's just that I think is one of the things that has polarized people is a lack of experience.
Yeah.
And just not realizing that there's truly so much more. And all of these things that you take for granted and you find comfortable, like that is very much a privilege. That's not going to make you very resilient.
Yeah.
You know, and we're seeing that. We're seeing what that has resulted in, which is you don't look like me, so we cannot engage. Like you're somehow the other, just based on that. But we all experience the same things. We all have fears and loss and loneliness, and none of us feel like we belong.
Right.
That's actually has nothing to do with any amount of safety you can create.
Yeah.
You have to create that for yourself. And it is by engaging with as much as you can.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. So I hear you saying like for you, it's kind of like a surrender to being able to control like circumstances that are shifting, but then like a really kind of intense like ownership of like your own, how you're gonna handle it or how you're going to operate within that is like what I heard you describe.
Yeah, you know, that or just kind of being tossed into it and just like floating anyway.
It's like it's gonna be, it's just gonna flow. Yeah. That's cool.
I think one of my favorite, I tell this story a lot, but one of my favorite stories about like bringing yourself into a group of people or being real or whatever. This was years and years ago. I had a friend that had gone to study in Paris. And this was like in the 80s or 90s. This is a while ago. And so there wasn't like cell phones or internet, and she went off to study abroad. She was American, and she was in Paris, and it was winter time, and she blew her nose, and it was like all black. And she was so afraid. She didn't know how to like even contact a doctor. Like she barely talked to her parents, you know. It was just like kind of isolated, you know. You guys are too young to know these things, but you know, to not have a cell phone or not be able to reach people, it was just a normal occurrence. So she went to her class, and she was kind of shaken up or whatever, and the teacher was late coming to class, and one of the students said, "Hey, is anybody else like having black stuff coming out of their nose?" And she was like, "Yes." And like several other people were like, "Me too." And it was because there's so many smokestacks in the area where they were, and there was just a lot of soot in the air, and so they just, you know, had soot in their nose. And it's just this example of like, you know, there's a lot of shared experiences. There's a lot of shared mess that we're not always able to communicate, but once you say like, "Oh, I have, you know, black snot," someone else will go, "Ah, Me too. I'm so relieved to know that you also have black snot. And I think that's, the power of community, but also the fear, right? That like, oh, somehow my black snot is no one else
We'll be the
will
only
Yeah,
ever,
it's the-
yes. And someone will be just horrified
Yeah.
at my condition or whatever. But the more that we, share in the messiness, the more we realize, we're all in
particularly
this.
that humanness, right?
Yeah.
That humanness and that connection. Even like outside of the community thing, like that's just human to human.
Yeah.
And but it's the community fabric and that trust within it that allows the space to say that or share that.
Yeah. That's a beautiful thing.
It's a funny story. I mean, it's just, it's just always, not always. And you do have to have safe spaces, and you have to have built up. I mean, these were students that were in a class together, right? So that's a community too, right?
Yeah.
And so they did have sort of this, at least a shared experience, and many of them were from other places. So they had that also of like, oh, we're all sort of displaced, which was that's always a nice catalyst for a community, right? When everyone's sort of out of their element. There's nobody with with all the answers or whatever.
Yeah, totally. Like everyone's just figuring it out together.
Yeah.
And that actually triggered like a memory just sort of being in Taiwan and being sort of considered like an expat kid, and realizing that everybody was there not by choice, likely because something else brought them there.
Yeah.
And, despite all of the differences, despite not having shared language, not knowing anything about one another, just trusting that we're all in this experience together, and we're going to step forward that way.
Yeah.
And that's got me thinking now of like how far away we've come, that we don't feel like we're in community or we have that trust unless we intentionally say so, unless we draw this circle around these people and say, this is my community and this is where I feel safe, that we don't feel safe when we step out of that. And like, that's what like makes me very sad, but also is partially why I try to carry that from the moment I open my door.
Yeah.
Right? To remind people that you may not feel like you're in community, but you absolutely are.
Yeah.
And just if you see it that way, if you behave that way, it is that way.
Yeah.
So.
It's interesting. Earlier you said, we all need the other, right? And I think that's a big part of my faith journey, is like the unothering journey, and getting to the place where I don't need an other. And it's so hard. I mean, in this particular political environment, it's really hard to feel like, oh yeah, I could be loving and kind to people who think differently than me, when their actions are actually hurting others or speaking very angrily about others. Then it's hard to not. Anyway, it's hard to love. But I think it's always true that if you're sitting in a room with someone, you can find some small amount of common ground that you can then sort of maybe build on. But I feel like that's my goal, is to not need an other.
Yeah.
But
I think that's a good one. And I think that we would all benefit from deconstructing out of that. Is that maybe the word?
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that need. Yeah, but I think those who are, it's a Jesus thing of like, a camel going through the eye of a needle is what it's like for a rich man to try to like enter the kingdom, because it's like he has so much to give up, essentially. Like he has more to. That's like a thing that we talk about, and I think there is something like you said, that like your own personal secret sauce comes from resiliency. It comes from your experiences, and that people, the people that just the first time that they ever left home was an hour away to college, and they've just lost they've lost less things in their life than others, and they've had more privilege and had more given to them. If you don't have much practice in losing things, then community is hard because you have to give up quite a bit to live communally. And so, like, is there a piece there of like this kind of like, yeah, I don't know, like, how does that like translate into like stepping into community? Because like I know for me, I feel like I am one of those people who is kind of at the top of the privilege pyramid, right? And so, but for me, I realized like I'm not going to grow anymore if I just keep living with like. So I was really excited about community and living with people, but I was basically just living with my friends from college who were white, straight, cis guys, just like me, with this pretty similar perspective on everything and similar background. It's like I'm not going to. There's a ceiling to how much I can grow, even if no matter how intentional we are, and meals we eat together, and inviting people in, and doing all this cool work. There's a ceiling to how much I can grow and how much I can do for the world if I am not if I don't have any diversity in age of the people that I'm living with, of people's cultural background and experience, like difference in experiences, and like diversity in every sense. And I really, my thing is always like I want to grow, and I was noticing like I'm kind of reaching my ceiling in this space, and that's why I wanted to move into this kind of big group of people that are kind of different than me. And I was like, and the people that I most looked up to in my life were people that were, like you're saying, like uncomfortable. Like if you were saying like, if I'm not uncomfortable most days, then I'm probably doing something wrong, and I'm probably not growing. And I feel this is the same for me. It's like but even though I thought I'm going to dive into Jesus people and I'm going to get uncomfortable, it still was surprising how hard it was for me to lose things. Like it still was like kind of jarring, like how little compassion I actually have for people, and how little patience I actually have for people that are different. It was easy to have patience for people that were the same as me, but like, whoa, like it was jarring, to say the least. And I just wonder, like, I guess how privilege intersects with community life, and that's a really fascinating to me.
I think, I mean, just being able to choose and have intentional community is very privileged, right? Because a lot of people really can't make that choice. They are where they are, and that's that.
Yeah.
You know, as much as someone might want to go move out into like a rural area and live on like a farm and just, you know, be able to participate in a different kind of, like, that is not necessarily realistic, right? And so it's like, that's one piece of it. There's something that you were saying and totally made me lose my train of thought.
Something else that I was saying?
Yeah.
I saw a look in your eye. I was trying to remember what it was.
Yeah, and now I'm trying to like, where was that? Where was that moment? But it was
like always to be uncomfortable.
To be uncomfortable. Oh, you know what? It's about relationships, and like it's like any other relationship is, you kind of are attracted to one another and like being in that space and kind of growing together, and then at some point you sort of plateau and it's difficult to continue to choose to grow together, and you know, you kind of have to, that's how relationships go, right? There's that natural cycle of things, and it's okay. It doesn't mean that, you know, you're cutting something off or you're losing something or whatever it is. It's just, there are natural cycles. Everything has a natural cycle, and that's okay. And we've somehow made it really not okay. And there are all sorts of different reasons for why that is, from the different societal structures that are in place that say it must be this way or X, Y, and Z. But ultimately, these are all relationships, and all relationships are to help us grow, right? And see ourselves in different ways, and have deeper compassion for ourselves. And therefore others.
And I think that's hard. Again, that's hard if things aren't compartmentalized, and you're still like, your cycle has run up with that relationship or whatever, but you're still neighbors, you're still working together, you're still You know what I mean? There's not like a natural, like you're at college and you just kind of like start hanging out with another group of friends or whatever.
Well, that's the tension of the
Yeah.
not willing to release in whatever form that is. That's to say, that we were here in this place and it's
Yeah.
going to be like this for no, not necessarily, and that's okay. And it's okay to just be like, that was an awesome moment in this trajectory of
Yeah.
whatever this is, you know.
Well, I
Yeah.
think, there's so many things like Hollywood and
Yeah.
all these different factors that make us think that relationships are supposed to be easy or, can resolve in an hour-long program or whatever
Right.
it is.
Or like for an eternity or whatever. Whatever.
Right. But yeah, I've been married for 21 years. And so, our marriage looks very different today than it did when we were first married. There's,
imagine.
yeah, after 2 kids and, all the different changes that we've both gone through. And I think I'm a person who, I shouldn't say I like conflict because that sounds bad.
Embrace.
I see it as a tool. I see it as the way to grow.
It is.
And when we were first married, my husband thought that like a conflict was like, our marriage was ending or I didn't like him anymore. And not realizing the different ways we came at the idea of conflict caused even more conflict, right? Because I'm thinking, let's resolve this.
Yeah.
Let's just go for it. And he's like, oh, she doesn't like me and she thinks I'm a bad person. And it's like, oh, no. This, it was several years into our marriage where we did some marriage counseling, which was very helpful. That enabled us to see, we're just coming at this from totally different approaches, right? And if we had known that earlier, it would have been helpful.
Yeah.
But now, we are much more skilled at communicating. And also we have done a lot of our own work and we've grown, but we're different people than we were 21 years ago. So how do we keep walking down the path together? I think we have to always realize that it's going to be different, but different isn't bad.
Yeah. It's interesting. I think we have to reframe conflict.
Yeah.
Right? Because we see it as such a negative thing, but it's really, really not. And it's actually in the conflict that we are able to keep our individuality and explore our individuality even more.
Absolutely.
And then it makes our bonds that much more powerful because we can truly choose to be participating with one another as opposed to out of a place of need or a place of complacency. But like conflict is really to allow your individuality in a shared experience. So like
I love
that's
that.
kind of, I think, what we need to like keep pushing forward with. And like that's really the special piece. And it's in community that we can support one another in that individuality as opposed to from a selfish like place of getting you to be like X, Y, and Z. It's allowing you the space to explore whatever it is that will help you grow and become more you while allowing me to be me and us to participate here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah, it's great. It's basically saying like it's advocating for your individuality, but in the context of like, I need you to know this is how I feel and what my needs are, but I care about us doing well together and I care about you. So how do we figure out how both things happen? How like you exist and I exist and we exist.
And
like,
show up.
Yeah.
You know, and it's like, how do we keep showing up? Because I want to keep showing up with you guys.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And that's the community piece.
Yeah.
But that's scary to people. And I think it's because we don't see conflict modeled well. Like not even in
we all
movies
need
or
couples therapy.
Yeah.
We
right?
all, like our whole country needs to be in therapy.
Yeah. Together.
We all need mediation.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But no, I agree. I think, we talked about it quite a bit, Grace, like that's what I'm here for. Like in a sense, when I said like, I'm not going to be able to grow if I don't plug in with a bigger group of people that's more diverse. And that's what I was saying is I need to have more conflict essentially. Like I'm not having enough conflict with my group of a bunch of white dudes living together, like playing video games. Like we're kind of just doing a thing. And I need to have more diversity and different people and different perspectives so that we can have conflict and that we can grow from that.
Well, you said something years ago about how you don't have conflict with people that you don't care about. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
I think you've said that. I think I've heard you say that too.
Yeah, if you don't care, then you can just like write them off, or you can like
whatever,
just complain to your landlord about them, or whatever.
Exactly.
Like
or move.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
But if a relationship is going to continue, and if the relationship is important to you, then you're going to work through that, whatever that misunderstanding or hurt or whatever it is.
Yeah, I always feel it as love when somebody comes to me as like, that thing you said the other day, like that really hurt my feelings for these reasons, or like, what did you mean by that? Because I'm still thinking about it, or like the way you handled that situation did not bode well for me, or like it honestly doesn't happen as often as I'd like sometimes.
It's scary. It's hard. Like I'm thinking back to just the last couple of weeks and I'm like, yep, I had a lot of those moments where like I just, stopped like participating or didn't show up in like in a particular way, and it wasn't it. And like that's hard. Yeah.
And you can't just say that you're willing to have those kind of conversations. You also have to respond in a way that invites it, right?
Yeah.
Because I remember, this was years ago, that a good friend, she's quite a bit younger than me, was confronting me on something, and I could tell it was really hard for her to say it, and so it came out kind of angry and not mean, but like a little, well, you blah blah blah, that kind of tone or that kind of
tone.
Feeling. And I distinctly remember it because it was like this realization of like, you have told this person that you want them.
This is what you wanted.
You have invited them to say, hey, I want you to tell me if I'm hurting you, or I want you to tell me if I've done something. Yeah. So here's this moment. So how are you going to respond? And it was like such a watershed moment, because I was like, that must have been very difficult for her to say to me. That was like my takeaway, instead of like, well, your tone was very rude. You were
able to like feel that in the moment.
I was. It was a miracle. It really was a miracle, because I'm usually a very like fast reactor, and so I think that's another reason why it's a watershed moment for me, because it doesn't happen frequently that I'm able to like really process and not just blah. And so I was like, you've asked her to do this and she's doing it. Thank you for saying that. And it was just like, I do want that, and if I want it, I have to respond.
You have to hear through that. Yeah. And you have to suspend whatever the immediate reaction is, and just hear through that. Yeah. And that's part of that fabric of trust, is that, allowing someone the space to be able to say whatever it is that they need a space, and kind of allowing that to happen, and then moving forward from another space.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And valuing people. I mean, this, like, I could have just been like, oh, she's so young, and what does she know? There's this thing that you can other the person bringing the message, right? So that you don't have to hear it.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And then you're like...
And you're safe or whatever from growing.
Yeah. Oof.
Yeah, it's tempting. It's tempting.
It is tempting. Mm-hmm. But it's not worth it in the long run.
Yeah, I'm not always as good at it. I'm not always as good at doing that as I am at talking about doing that, but
most of us are that way.
But talking about it helps you to remember it, right? Like, even if you're, I don't know. I think it's fake it till you make it. I don't know.
Yeah. I feel like one sign that I feel like we're doing all right here at Jesus People with this funny game of conflict and just living life together is that I just feel like I laugh a lot at the just like, wow, this is hard. Like, this is ridiculous what we're trying to do. Like, this isn't normal, as in like this isn't how people generally live, and it's hard, and can we just take a moment to like laugh about kind of how ridiculous it is, and how ridiculous we are, like as humans, that we just like say we want this and then we like act, I don't know, it's just kind of so yeah, like there's something about just like not just like taking a deep breath and zooming out and like looking from the outside in of like how
that not taking it too seriously, right? Because we can get in like deep into the weeds of it, and it's like, okay, like this is kind of ridiculous, and like we can totally laugh about this and shake it off and like take another breath.
Yeah.
I loved what you said about like the stars are always the same. I think there's that perspective too of right, like that we're just such a tiny part of this universe, and it's just good to be reminded of like the vastness,
humbled,
and the constancy of this cosmos that we're a part of. I think I find nature really a way to not just be like centered, or not just to remind me of that, but also like when you were talking about earlier about the relationship, and I was talking about my marriage, like if I was more in touch with growing things, like sometimes I've been a little bit involved in this community garden. I was involved in making it happen, but then I haven't been as involved in growing things because it's not my wheelhouse, but I've learned a lot. And like, you have to cut back the raspberry bushes or you're not going to get new raspberries, right? And so there's just things about nature that if you're engaging in it, you can be like, oh, well, I mean, there's parts of my marriage that I kind of had to maybe prune or cut off in order for the
send
growth
energy to like the places that matter.
Yeah.
To bear more fruit.
Yeah.
And like things do need to hibernate to like like change the energy and like to have a different output.
Yeah.
We have to drop leaves.
Right. and it's okay. It's healthy.
We need to sleep.
Right.
Yeah.
So to like maybe wrap things up, I'm interested in like how are you feeling about your own endeavors moving forward, coming out of the pandemic? Like what is your kind of like what are you excited about right now? What are you hoping for?
I'm excited that people seem to be talking about their willingness to live in community. And for me, I see it in so many different ways. Like there's what you guys do and how you live, but then there are other people who are nowhere near ready or able to, right? And everybody lives in a different kind of way and experience. And for me, from a development side, I'm like, okay, how do I put this all together into something so that I can help people step into that experience and to be able to successfully navigate that, not just in the space of building a space or figuring out a way to like finance it, but like now the people component, which is really where the value of what I'm trying to do is. And tying that all together. But at least like people are wanting to have these conversations, and I'm trying to get into those, meet them there so that we can build that together.
Well, I'm kind of amazed by you and your like diversity of gifts, like the fact that you know how to own a space and like develop it and do rent and like all that kind of stuff. And you're also, when you talk about how to relate to people, you're kind of speaking my language as kind of an HR guy. I'm like, yeah. But I'm like, I can't do all that other stuff that you're talking about. Like I can't imagine being in charge of that and like using both sides of my brain in that way. And so I'm just kind of amazed that you're able to.
Oh, it's a mess.
It's a mess. But it's happening.
It is. It's
happening. Your mess.
It is. It's my mess.
Yeah.
I'm willing to share it.
That's great.
I'm excited to see where it goes, and I'm excited to be so close to be able to actually like come over and see what you're doing over there as things open up. It's exciting. Glad to be neighbors.
I never thought of living in sort of a apartment building or with a landlady as
Yeah.
being sort of like an intentional community, but Grace made it seem like that.
Yeah, well, now that I think about it, the only other apartment that I've lived in, like between college and moving here, was like we knew it was like a family, like
Yeah.
our landlord, and we would watch their dog and say hi to them all the time. And so, but she's got like several tenants, so it's like
Yeah.
a lot to manage. Really cool talking to her, and glad she lives so close so that we can kind of stay connected with how that journey goes for her. Yeah, so thanks for tuning in, everyone. Remember to email us at the intentional. You got it.
intentionalcommunitypodcast@gmail.com.
Yeah, that's the one. Thanks, y'all.